So some of you may have noticed by now that my side of the room is looking actually quite awkward and quite British. There isn't actually a single Russian person on my side representing Russia. Now, we as a union are supposed to be able to host events which can sort of offer a platform for freedom of speech to just about anybody. However, what I believe is that in the chamber today we face something far more anti-democratic and far more dangerous than what those protesters stood for against Marine Le Pen just 2 weeks ago. Because this event really failed before it even began. The question I think we have to ask is, why did every official representative of the Kremlin either not reply or have absolutely no interest in coming? Why was it so easy for us to find speakers not just to criticize Russia, but Putin as a whole? And I believe that the answers to this question is that despite the fact that we in the West, we in the UK, pride ourselves on living in the land of the free, some ideas we find distasteful and they don't quite make it into the headlines, or in this case, even before a bunch of students. And so what we really should be asking is, why would they bother to come to this room, or this country for that matter, full of people whose opinions of Russia haven't drastically changed since 1945? I think it's extremely sad that people like me stand before you today, that 3 foreigners stand to defend the biggest country in the world, the country we've so firmly turned our back towards. So it should come as absolutely no surprise to you that the proposition is extremely strong today. I think she needs no introduction after that speech, but we had Molly McParland. She's doing her MPhil in Russian and Eastern European studies, specializing in Russian politics and foreign relations. Next we have Luke Harding, possibly the UK's most famous critic of all things Russian, and the first journalist to be expelled from Russia since the end of communism. And finally...
point of information.
No, thanks.
Okay.
And finally we have Andrei Shevchenko, a freedom fighter in his purest form, and the real godfather figure in Ukrainian independent media. It's an unbelievable honor to be stood before you today, and you. And I hope you'll join me in thanking them for coming to speak to us. And to anybody in this room who is Russian or Ukrainian or from any corner of the Slavic or Central Asian world, I hope so sincerely that anything I do say won't come as offensive, but this all does come from a person with a great appreciation and love of all those places. And furthermore, I don't really think that I'm going to disagree with a lot of the things that the proposition will say to you today. Russia clearly is not a place which is governed by a democratic leader. It is clearly not a place where men and women are equal. It's not even a place where basic human rights are upheld. But what I can't emphasize enough is that that really doesn't have much to do with our debate this evening. This debate is about whether Putin is building an empire, and that's a very different question indeed. And I hope that in the short time that we have together, I can convince you that it really isn't the case. And the way I'm going to do this is twofold. Firstly, I'd like to talk about Putin, his background and his motives, and secondly, a short analysis of Ukraine. I'm going to try and keep things as broad and general as possible and simply just appeal to your common sense. So what's so fascinating about Putin as a politician is that he came absolutely out of nowhere. Masha Gessen famously describes him as the man without a face. Despite the fact that he'd been in the KGB and head of the FSB, people didn't really know who he was. You know, famously, members of his own party during speeches in support of him didn't even know his name. And so this unknown prime minister certainly was a man with a plan. And it's really interesting to look back at some of the things which he was writing in the mid-90s, when he was effectively a nobody. He wasn't yet head of the FSB, and any ideas of becoming prime minister or president weren't in his wildest dreams. And he was writing about how he personally could be the man that could return Russia to its previous power. He wrote not a particularly fascinating article, which was ironically plagiarized from American academics, called The Strategic Planning of the Reproduction of the Resources Bases. And essentially what he outlined was that the way that Russia could become great again was through the export of its natural resources. And you may be wondering why I'm telling you these boring things. It's because, funnily enough, the oil, the gas, the minerals, the money in Russia isn't beneath the foundations of the Kremlin, but instead in places like the Caucasus, places that Molly kept mentioning, places that Russia's been fighting over, for hundreds of years. There are 22 semi-autonomous states within the boundaries of Russia, places like Abkhazia, North and South Ossetia, Chechnya. It's no wonder that Putin rekindled the war there when its other name is Ichkeria, the land of the minerals. And all amongst this mess is a country called Ukraine, literally translated as the borderland, which is situated in probably one of the most strategic linking areas between the Caspian Basin, the Black Sea, and the rest of Europe. And so I painted this picture of Putin as a military man, a man whose popularity polls were skyrocketing simply due to the fact that the economy was recovering naturally. And any politician in his position would benefit from that. And so the very crux of his rule, the crux of his popularity, is the ruble and oil prices. And so when the economy is intentionally undermined by foreign states, that's when things begin to get extremely ugly, and innocent people, as in people in Ukraine, suffer beneath the clash of great powers. So this really brings me on to talking about Ukraine. So let's hear from Putin himself, something which doesn't happen too often. He said this in 1999, "Russia has been a great power for centuries and remains so. It has always had and still has legitimate zones of interest abroad in both the former Soviet lands and elsewhere. We should not drop our guard in this respect, neither should we allow our opinion to be ignored." And so Putin really highlights something which other politicians are terrified to say, that the modern, acceptable version of an empire is an immaterial sphere of influence, and then the West tread on his, and that led to a war. We accept the concept of the EU, of regional economic integration, as something which is normal and something which is healthy. And yet, when Putin creates something like the Eurasian Economic Union, we immediately describe him as the bear on the loose, and David Cameron even referred to him as Hitler, compared him to Hitler. And so the West criticizes him for recreating the Soviet Union. And I utterly reject the argument that Russia annexed the Crimea due to the fact that it believed it had legitimate historical connections with it. And I reject that Putin invaded Crimea due to any expansionist or imperialist desire for more territory. What I want to argue is that the Ukrainian crisis is due to the fault of the international community. And I think it's a complete outrage that the proposition will argue to you today that it's solely the fault of one man trying to build an empire. There is war in Europe, there's 5,000 plus people dead, and the person who's solely taking the blame is Vladimir Putin. So let's finally compare Putin's words with a cute little quote from John Kerry, who said, "You don't just invade other countries on a phony pretext in order to assert your interests." And so sadly, John Kerry couldn't be here this evening. But just in case he manages to catch this on YouTube, I won't mention Iraq, I won't mention Afghanistan, but what would you say to the billions of American dollars being poured in to Russia's most politically sensitive neighbors of Georgia and Chechnya and Dagestan for the purpose of democratization? What have you to say, most importantly, of the US oil giant Chevron arranging a shale gas deal with Ukraine for this purpose, that the ex-Soviet nation hopes it could end its energy dependence on Russia by 2020? This entire crisis is a game of oil, and it's a game of prestige. It's not even impressive enough to call it a game of empires. That's not on the agenda. And so I'd like to really end on the following note, that it was a year ago today that I was pretty near to the biggest airbase in Russia before the border with Ukraine. And as these planes started flying over, there were people who came out into the streets with tears in their eyes yelling, "Ura!" And Putin uses this kind of fervor for his presidency and this patriotism to justify his annexation of the Crimea. But it is so naive to not realize how superficial that act is, that this crisis is due to economic pressure of the international community. And finally, the thing I'd like to end on, the thing I'd like to end on is that there's a long and naive tradition of the West of basing opinions on Russia by the richer areas of Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when Putin came into power, people were astounded that there was even bread in the shops. Even today, you drive out of Moscow and you find these towns which don't survive on much more than porridge and potatoes and vodka. And I really think that after the horrors and the torment and the suffering of the Soviet Union, it's amazing that there's a man, undemocratic as he is, that unites Russia. And I can only say that even though he doesn't know it, there's perhaps a democratic future for it. And I think for that, we should be thankful. So thanks.